Good morning, friends. Today we are going to talk about Homike Bhabha's essay of Mimicry and Man. In today's lecture, I'd like to tackle a very interesting and important observation of Bhabha's. He talks about mimicry in the form of a question, actually a series of questions. Actually, it's the beginning of a paragraph of Mimicry and Man. And I will request one of you to read it. But before I do that, I must tell you something about certain other things. Now, if you remember in my introduction to Homike Bhabha, I told you about Bhabha's training in psychoanalysis and post-structuralism. He is a very important post-colonial theorist. And he was greatly influenced by people like Freud and Lacan on the one hand, and even there is an bath and in an oblique, indirect way. Now, Lacan has talked about 4 drives, of which the scopic drive is one. We all know that scopic or scopia, scope means to see. You think about the scopic drive as one of the 4 primary drives. And a la Michel Foucault, in the manner of Michel Foucault, Bhabha also talks about surveillance. Colonial surveillance, for example. And there is also another term from psychoanalysis that he frequently uses or has in mind. I am talking about the narcissistic spirit, We all know that Narcissus was a character from Greek mythology. Was very, very handsome, fell in love with his own reflection in the pool. Now, this narcissistic drive is something, the spirit of narcissism is something that is at the back of many of our motives, many of our actions. Especially in the colonial context, the narcissistic drive is there. When you impose as a colonizer your culture, your language, your literature, your way of life, your place names and all that, what you are actually trying to do is you are in a way trying to appropriate the colonized places. And you are also trying to appropriate the colonized peoples. You think about it. New Orleans, New York, New South Wales, New Zealand, all these places were colonized and renamed in utter disregard of their heritage. the heritage of those places. This is something we have to understand. This is something we have to understand. Now, coming back, I would like to remind you of three other terms. One, mimesis; two, mimicry; and three, mockery. You know, mimesis, if you have read your Plato and Aristotle, you must remember that mimesis is all about imitation. Now, mimicry is a purposive imitation and a limited imitation. It's a partial imitation. And mockery is basically an ironic imitation. You know. So if in mimicry if in mimesis there is a wholeheartedness in the act of imitation and the intention of imitation, then in mockery there is an absolute derision in the spirit and in the act as well. And mimicry comes in between. There is a partial imitation, there is a strategic imitation. And you know, the discursive plane of mimicry is basically ambivalent. It is ambivalent, and as such, there is always an ideological balancing act being performed by two contending discourses in the true dialogic sense. So with this prologue, let me now get into today's quotation. Now, one of you will read the beginning of this paragraph. Vikram?
Yes, sir. What is the nature of the hidden threat of the partial gaze? How does mimicry emerge as the subject of the scopic drive and the object of colonial surveillance? And how is desire disciplined, authorized displaced?
Authority is displaced. Authority displaced.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So where is the hidden threat of the partial gaze? You know, as I was telling you, there is there is the involvement of a partial gaze. Now, there is also a hidden threat. You know, the threat of subversion of authority, subversion of authority, subversion of colonial authority. And as such, mimicry emerges as the subject of a scopic drive. When mimicry is imposed upon the colonized, there is a scopic drive. A narcissistic spirit is at work. And as such, you know, the colonizer tries to create likable resemblance of himself, his culture, his language, his customs, and so on and so forth. As such, what happens is, you know, it also emerges as an object of colonial surveillance. The colonized is always surveyed. It is the object of a surveillance. Because the colonizer always conceives of a kind of vulnerability, because the corona is possesses not only an enigma but also a threat. As such, the desire of the colonized is in some ways disciplined. By trying to imitate the colonizer, it can discipline its desire of mockery in a way of half-hearted adoption of the colonizer's ways. As such, what happens is, the authority is displaced. Because if I can mimic you, or if you can mimic me, at heart you know that you are always keeping that point of prohibition, just as the colonizers know. The point of prohibition comes in when the colonizer does not want the similarity to become absolute identification. There has to be some difference, some distance, some dissimilarity in the imitator and the imitated. But in a curious twist to this situation, from the perspective of the colonized, there is also a displacement of authority, colonizers' authority, colonial authority, because, by adopting this mimic customs, the colonized is also hoodwinking, lulling the colonizer into a kind of a false security from which they will be rudely awakened at a future time. So, this was my discussion of Bhaba's observation. Well, at this juncture, I will request you to ask questions if you have any. If you have any questions, you may ask.
Sir, in India's case, the partial gauge, from approximately from when does it begin? Is it before the Victoria um, uh, pronounces herself as the Empress of India?
No. It cannot be. It cannot be that, because you are forgetting very conveniently Macaulay's minute and William Bentinck. It was in the 1830s.
Yes, sir.
And Victoria's proclamation came much later. One thing you have to understand, in such cultural encounters, especially in any international, intercultural contexts, you cannot actually pinpoint a particular date or a year. However, the period can be ascertained. You have to understand first thing you have to understand is that this partial gauge was there from the very beginning, but it gained prominence only after the Britishers, because the British were the colonizers in the case of India. When they became powerful and when they gained control in the cultural front, that came after the political control. You have to understand this. Then and only then could such things be began in a big way. Are you getting my point?
Yes, sir.
Any other question, my dear students?
Yes, sir, I have a question. Sir, as mimicry relates to the colonized adopting the colonizers' culture, so can we say it's a kind of anxiety of the colonizers?
Very interesting question. An element of anxiety was always there in the colonizer. When I was talking about the ambivalence of the colonial discourse, there are certain internal contradictions in the colonial discourse, because the colonizers, in order to justify their own perceived superiority, they had conceived of the natives, the colonized, as both inferior and different. Similarly, the colonized were conceived of both as ignorant, childlike, childish fellows, puerile, and also as an irrational threat. Because every kind of irrational feeling was ascribed to them. Laziness, sloth, lechery, dishonesty, and all that. But at the same time, there was at the back of their minds the realization that if these colonized were to revolt, they could drive the handful of colonizers into the sea. And that is why there was this point of prohibition. This concept of not white, not white, not white, that Bhabha has actually referred to in his essay. In a way, alludes to or hints at not only the cultural difference involved therein, that means the process of colonization and retention of colonial control, but also some kind of an anxiety. Because the mimic men were supposed to be like the colonizers, but they were also very scrupulously debarred from having any privilege in the colonizers' society. Okay. I will refer you to a character like Babu Navkishan Panda in the Ibis trilogy by Amitabh Ghosh. In the context, in this connection, I would like to mention, if you don't know already, that Janjibari British novelist Abdul Razzaq Gurnah has been awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature this year. And very curiously, one of my scholars, Devan Banerjee, he is working on the novels of Abdul Razzaq Gurnah and is likely to submit his thesis by the year's end. Okay. The reason why Gurnah came to my mind just now was also, in a way, related to this idea of mimicry. In the case of Zanzibar, exposed as it has been to Western control of sorts by Britain, Germany, and so on and so forth. You know, the element of mimicry has been there in the formation of the post-colonial Zanzibari consciousness, of which the diasporic writer Abdul Razzaq Gurna can be put as a very brilliant case in point. Just as V.S. Naipaul or M.G. Bhasanji may also be thought in that light. Okay, any other question? Any other question from any other source? It's really curious that only two boys, Sondipan and Bikram, are likely to ask questions. No other soul, not a single girl, has ever asked questions. It's peculiar. Okay, since there are no questions, I'd like to come to the end of today's academic part. So, Shubhankita, you may stop the recording.